What is going on, everybody? In today's video, we are going to be breaking down the 6 running backs that I believe have the highest overall upside on a week in, week out basis in all of fantasy football. What I'll do for this video is I'm going to be avoiding the first 2 rounds or so. I'm not going to talk about players like Devon Achane, who we already know has a super high ceiling, or Brees Hall, who, Bijan Robinson, guys who you're going to have to spend a high draft selection on. I'm not going to talk about Jahmyr Gibbs, right? We're going to be looking at players in the 3rd round and on who have that same type of pass catching upside, who can bring a high weekly ceiling every single week to your fantasy roster, and break down why those players can do so. If you are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you're into that, be sure to subscribe on the way in. Other than that, let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video. All right, first on the list is going to be James Cook. Has an ADP of 55 on the dot on Underdog, then an ADP of 44.1 overall on the Sleeper app. James Cook, I think, is set for a great fantasy season. He's a player I've been really targeting, talking about all offseason long. Average double-digit fantasy points per game last year, finished as the RB12, and just doesn't really feel like anyone thinks he's going to repeat as a top 12 running back this year for the most part. Like, he gets kind of passed on in drafts. I mean, I know he's still technically being drafted as a top 12 running back, but it's not like people are really talking about James Cook feeling like a good option going into next year. I think that's because towards the end of last year, especially, although we saw it early in the year as well, Josh Allen was running for touchdowns what felt like every single week. I mean, you look between week 7 and week 17, Josh Allen had a rushing touchdown in all those games except for week 11 against the Jets. So I totally get that. But I think when you look at this offense as a whole, even though Josh Allen's probably going to run a ton this year, he also has a whole new room of wide receivers, right? And I think Kincaid at the tight end position is going to be the focal point. But at the end of the day, that's going to leave a lot of receptions for James Cook at the running back position. His PPR upside is huge. And on top of that, you're going to see less touchdowns scored by the wide receiver position with Stephon Diggs gone in this offense. I'm not discrediting rookie Keon Coleman. I'm not discrediting Curtis Samuel or Khalil Shakir on this offense. I just really think that this offense at the end of the day is going to be ran through the running back position in James Cook, as well as the tight end position with Dalton Kincaid, and then, of course, Josh Allen's natural talent. But just think there's more touchdowns on the table for James Cook. I think there's a lot more receptions on the table for James Cook. We saw 44 total receptions off of 54 targets. Last year, 445 total receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, and 10.11 yards per catch for Cook last year. I think all of that can easily improve this year. Love his PPR upside. I think he is going to have more opportunities to score this year. So I'm all in on James Cook. I think he brings a lot of value in terms of upside to your roster, especially where you're drafting him moving into 2024. All right, next up is Rashad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, an ADP of 62.6 on Underdog, an ADP of 38 overall on the Sleeper app. So on Sleeper, he's going before James Cook, who we just talked about. And I mean, if you guys have followed the channel throughout the offseason, you've heard me talk about Rashad White all offseason long. Don't understand his ADP. I don't really know the last time in fantasy football where we had a top 5 running back, the RB4 overall, just get like pushed back to the middle end of the 3rd round, sometimes beginning of the 4th round in fantasy drafts, at least for most single quarterback redraft formats. That's where you're seeing him go. But like I said, in Underdog, sometimes he falls back to like pick 70s. So for me, Rashad White, I don't really understand this. Nothing has changed on paper for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense other than Dave Canales, now the head coach of the Carolina Panthers, no longer the offensive coordinator here. But I still think White is in line for a ton of volume. I get he wasn't super efficient as a running back last year on the ground, but he had 70 targets, 64 receptions, 549 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns, as well as 8.58 yards per catch. And that's going to be kind of a theme throughout today's list as we're looking at running backs who really bring that PPR upside, that pass catching ability on a week in, week out basis. And I know that people like Bucky Irving, I know that people will mention Sean Tucker, and even every now and then someone might mention Chase Edmonds, but it's really Bucky Irving. And don't get me wrong, Bucky Irving and Sean Tucker have looked decent in the preseason with the touches that they've gotten, but I think at the end of the day, this is still Rashad White's backfield because he's the most talented running back here. And he is easily the running back who gives you the most PPR upside, has the ability to have the most receptions of any of these running backs. Still had 15.8 fantasy points per game last year. Just like I said, I don't understand how a top 4 running back from the previous season is just sliding so far back in drafts. He has a tremendous amount of upside on a weekly basis. Absolutely love him at his current ADP. No reason to pass on Rashad White moving into 2024. All right, next on the list is Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks, going at an ADP of 51.8 on Sleeper, but an ADP of 65.7 on Underdog. And so far throughout the offseason, gotten a lot of good coach speak, a lot of good praise for Kenneth Walker coming out of training camp. And really what we have collected from the offensive coaches here is that Kenneth Walker is going to be a true 3-down back for the Seattle Seahawks, but also get heavily involved in the passing game as well and see plenty of targets. So we can expect his total targets to go up this year. He had 35 in his rookie season, 37 last year. I think we could see that get up to the 50-55 mark, which is going to be more receptions, more total receiving yards, and hopefully more receiving touchdowns as well. He improved from his rookie to his sophomore season in both receiving yards and receiving touchdowns, as well as targets and receptions. Last year still had 13.3 fantasy points per game. And I think it's interesting because when you look back to 2023 going into the year, people were still felt good about Kenneth Walker. Where he went in drafts was still the beginning of the 3rd round guy. And then this year he's fallen back a bit to like middle of the 5th, 6th round. It kind of depends on your league, how they feel about him. But really, when you break down the stats from 2022 to 2023, he was the RB 18 and the RB 19. They're really not that different when you break them down overall. So I feel like Kenneth Walker, just at the end of the day, is a steal in fantasy drafts. And then we've got lots of good coach speak coming out. He's going to get plenty of touches. And this offense should be improved this year under a new offensive coordinator. Still got plenty of firepower on this offense, even if they were disappointing last year. They should still be in the red zone plenty. And when they are, Kenneth Walker is going to be one of the most viable options. And like I said, he's going to be more involved in the passing game, according to the offensive coaches of the Seattle Seahawks. So his upside should be way higher. And this is one of the, I think, the player on today's list that brings the most overall upside just as a true runner and off of the rushing attempts alone. But I also expect him to have a large increase in overall receptions and targets, which is going to help that upside at the end of the day. So also just a great bargain where he's being drafted overall. Kenneth Walker, I still think a ton of upside going into 2024. Do not forget that I am still running several streams throughout the week where I am hopping into real 2024 fantasy football drafts on Underdog Fantasy. If you guys don't want to wait any longer to draft 2024 fantasy football teams, you don't have to. Underdog has all kinds of different unique contests that you guys can enter, including their flagship Best Ball Mania, where somebody is going to win up to $1.5 million. This is the best way to prepare for the upcoming fantasy football season. These are the sharpest drafts throughout the offseason. Plus, Underdog already has week 1 NFL pick'ems out, where you guys can play in their new streaks format and win up to 1,000x your money. Promo code the catch, the link is down below as well. Get you a first time 50% deposit match up to $250 plus a mystery pick'em that you guys can use towards that streaks up to 1,000x your money. Promo code the catch. Don't forget, when you sign up, we'll get you that first time 50% deposit match on Underdog Fantasy. All right, a player being drafted very close to Kenneth Walker is Alvin Kamara of the Saints, an ADP of 71.2 on Underdog and an ADP of 49.3 on the Sleeper app. And it's kind of interesting. Some people, like when they think back to last year, they just think of that little stretch between weeks 4 and week 7 for Alvin Kamara, where he had 8 or more targets in 3 of those games. and 14 targets in 2 of those games. And they're like, after that, he fell off. But in week 8, he just had 5 targets and he had 27 fantasy points, right? And then you start to look a little bit further. He had double digit fantasy points every game he started last year, except for week 16 and 17. So for 2 games. And yeah, you needed him in those weeks. Don't get me wrong. It's super disappointing. That's the fantasy semi and fantasy championship, right? But at the end of the day, still a ton of double digit fantasy performances and still a ton of games where he came out with multiple receptions and a pretty high receiving mark for the most part as well. Then you look at the fact that he only played in 13 games last year, but he had 86 total targets, 75 receptions, 466 receiving yards, and honestly, just 1 receiving touchdown doesn't make you feel great, but it also leads to the fact that we should see positive regression in all of those categories because Alvin Kamara is theoretically going to play an entire season this year. This is another team, the new offensive coordinator that should be better with Derek Carr at his second year quarterback. And that's another thing that should give you more hope for Alvin Kamara at his ADP is the fact that Derek Carr is going to be the quarterback here again. And obviously, Derek Carr likes to dump the football off to Alvin Kamara. So, I mean, he was the RB11 last year and is definitely not being drafted as such. Once again, finished as the RB11 just through 13 games last year. I mean, that's not like a massive, fall off in terms of total games played, but it's still not a full season. So I like Kamara at his given ADP, and I still think his PPR upside, his pass catching upside is tremendous. He definitely should be drafted, I think, a tad bit higher, maybe even a tad bit more aggressively. But at the end of the day, what we do know is that he brings plenty of upside to the table. All right, next up, let's talk about my boy DeAndre Swift, an ADP of 90.1 on Underdog, an ADP of 64 overall on the Sleeper app. And DeAndre Swift, a player who I'm looking at just purely based on pass catching upside. Yes, I've been talking about DeAndre Swift all off season long. Yes, I've been drafting DeAndre Swift all off season long, but I do think when you really break it down, you look at the running backs on this roster right now, maybe Khalil Herbert does get touches, right? Maybe Roshan Johnson gets involved here as well. The most talented running back on the Bears offense is DeAndre Swift, and the running back who brings the most pass catching upside is easily DeAndre Swift. We've already seen that in the preseason with that 42-yard or I should really say that short reception that he took 42 yards and then was taken out of the game. And I think, once again, people worrying about DeAndre Swift's usage in the preseason, I think everyone knows that DeAndre Swift is a little bit injury prone. They're probably just trying to preserve him for the regular season. So I'm not that worried about it. But at the end of the day, in RB2 last year, the RB20 overall was on a great pace until the Eagles' offense took a little bit of a dip, but also the tush push really took over. We're not going to see that this year. You're going to see plenty of wide receivers, pass catchers on this team score touchdowns between Rome Odunze, Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, and Cole Kmet. But I think that we're going to see a lot of DeAndre Swift, whether it's in the red zone or just as a kind of safety security blanket for Caleb Williams when he's looking to dump the football off. So I like DeAndre Swift's potential role in this offense a lot. I think he can easily have an average of double-digit fantasy points per game again in 2024. And once again, I think he's easily the most talented running back on the Bears offense, on their roster, and really, truly the only running back who brings true pass catching upside on a week in, week out basis. And on top of all that, he's a really cheap running back when you look at his overall ADP. So I still believe that he brings plenty of upside to the table, and he's still a running back that I'm targeting for that reason. All right, last but certainly not least is Taj Spears of the Tennessee Titans, an ADP of 108.8 on Underdog, ADP of 108.2 on the Sleeper app. A running back that you don't have to draft at a high draft capital. Running back that had 6 double-digit finishes last year behind Derrick Henry. A running back who had 70 total targets in his rookie season. Once again, behind Derrick Henry. 52 total receptions for 385 receiving yards, 7.4 yards per catch, receiving touchdown. And then on the ground, off just 100 attempts, had 453 rushing yards, 4.53 yards per carry. So I get it. Pollard's here. We might really see a 50-50 split here. This might be, in terms of backfield right now, the one backfield where we see a true 50-50 split. That might not make you feel good, and it might make you feel like there's not as much upside here, and that's perfectly fine. And Tony Pollard looked good, or has looked good so far in the preseason, I should say. But I think the running back again here who brings that pass catching upside, who brings that PPR upside is Taj Spears. And I do think we can see a world where both are involved. Taj Spears is still a viable week in, week out flex option. And then, of course, we could also see a world where both running backs are involved. And maybe Pollard is efficient, a good on the ground runner. But the Titans are not going to be able to deny the fact that they need Taj Spears on the field at times because he is such a good, viable pass catching option for this offense as well, that I think is definitely going to be throwing the football more in 2024 than they were in 2023, especially when you look at some of the moves they made in the offseason with guys like Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd. And I mean, hopefully we get DeAndre Hopkins back sooner rather than later. This offense definitely trying to build around a young quarterback in Will Levis and maybe get back to what we saw Will Levis do against the Falcons last year. We'll see. At the end of the day, they're surrounding him with pass catching options. And I think at the running back position, it's going to continue to be Tajay Spears, not down on Pollard by any means. And he was still an RB2 last year as the RB14 in fantasy football. So I'm definitely not counting him out as part of this offense. But I think Tajay Spears is the running back with more upside, and a running back late in drafts that you should definitely take a shot on because he brings that pass catching upside on a weekly basis. That'll do it for today's video. There are the running backs from round 3 later on that have the highest overall upside in all of fantasy football. Let me know what you guys thought of today's list. Let me know if there are players that you think were missing or players that shouldn't have been on today's list. And of course, let me know what running backs you guys are targeting as the rounds go on when you are looking for upside. If you guys did enjoy the content today or are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe on the way out and join the community, and drop any fantasy football questions that you guys have down below. Redraft, dynasty, best ball, whatever it may be, let me know. I will get back to you as soon as I can. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.